Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Bluelock's Recovery as a Service Technical Deep Dive webinar. My name is John Corwin. I'm Bluelock's Senior Digital Marketing Coordinator, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. A few housekeeping items to cover before we get started. Please feel free to submit any questions or comments you have throughout the presentation using the chat or Q&A panels within the WebEx tool. We'll do our best to tackle those near the end of the session. We also encourage you to tweet about the session using hashtag #BLRaaS. Lastly, as a reminder, we are recording this presentation and we'll be sure to send you the video recording as well as a copy of the presentation slides within the next few business days. And before we kick things off, we'd just like to launch a quick poll. Pull that up, just to help kind of better cater today's presentation to your needs. This just kind of helps us understand where you guys are. Not sure why that's not going. So, not sure why we're having polling difficulties, but we will get that up here shortly. Sorry about that. Pat, if you'd like to flip to the next slide. Our presenters today are Bluelock's Chief Technology Officer, Pat O'Day, and our Sales Engineer, Craig Herring. This webinar will last no more than 1 hour. We'll try to get you guys out a little bit before 3 today. During the session, Pat will take us through a deep dive into the architecture and implementation of Bluelock's Recovery as a Service solution. He'll also share 2 demos that highlight how RaaS quickly and effectively protects your applications and explain how to make the next move. With that, I'll hand the reins off to Pat.
Yeah, thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. So we have some other material. Given that this is a deep dive, hopefully you've seen either some information on Recovery as a Service in Bluelock previously. If you haven't, and you may be starting with a deep dive, we just want to let you know that there's some other sources in terms of setting up a DR strategy in a more modern way, architecting Recovery as a Service specifically, or we also have a session on budgeting, because budgeting is a lot different and fortunately a lot easier than it might be with a traditional DR-based solution, and all those are available as webcasts at the link below. So how does it work? We wanted to be specific. Bluelock today is able to provide several different DR solutions. We have highly available solutions, which means there's basically 0 downtime. We also have more backup-like systems. So if you don't have an urgent need, you just want to make sure that your applications are able to be recovered within a few days down here for support systems or other ancillary systems. But what we're going to focus on today is critical applications that might not be architected for high availability, but still are important enough to the business that you need to get them back in a few hours instead of a few days, few weeks, or a few months. And most companies that we work with have applications that spread out across all 3 areas. And we have, like I said before, we have a virtual data center that can accommodate all those. But the one we're going to focus on today is specifically the 4-hour or less recovery time objective. So traditional DR sites, if you've ever put the costs together, they look a lot like production if you do them right, because they need to be designed as if the application will ultimately run in production there. That can be really frustrating to people in charge of the budget, the CFO and the CIO, because they're spending a lot of money on insurance. Most of those components are our infrastructure, so CPU, RAM, storage, network capacity, et cetera, but you also have to get a lot of software licenses and their operating costs. There's power, space, maintenance, cooling, and even maybe some staff time dedicated to testing and operating the site. With Recovery as a Service, you're primarily paying only for the storage itself, because it's very similar to a backup solution where we're backing up your data and your VM environment. And then resources like CPU, RAM, licenses, etc., network capacity, disk I/O are all added only when you do a test or when you use the solution during a disaster event itself. And when you're done using the environment, those costs go away and you go back down to just the storage cost. So how does it work? This is a bit of a busy picture, so I'll walk through it, but hopefully it'll show you the solution in action. So during a actual DR event, you could say this is during a test as well. It functions very similarly. There are a number of components. So primarily you have your data center environment here. You could be hosting this with Bluelock in the cloud with a colocation provider or in a data center that your company operates itself. But the key is this is an environment that you control. There could be 3, there could be 300 applications running in that environment. Depending on the type of business that you have, you might be supporting users in remote offices. You might be supporting retail stores or points of sale. Just whoever those constituents are that are using these applications, the real key is what happens to them and what happens to the applications if this site is somehow unavailable. We have solutions today where we've implemented recovery as a service over the internet, private networking solutions based on security, predictable performance, a lot of factors there. But the key is they generally work the same way. So what happens when there's actually a failure? So before the failure, the important thing is to connect the production environment to the Bluelock backup environment and establish a IP connection to perform what's called continuous data protection. And what continuous data protection does, it's a little different than snapshots or backups in that it doesn't wait for every 15 minutes to capture a bunch of data, send it over to the backup site. It doesn't do it every 24 hours. It literally does it the minute data changes here. So if a user saves a PowerPoint presentation to the F drive, those changes are immediately sent over to the backup site. If a new user logs into a web application that you host and orders some product or updates their registration information, the minute that they hit submit, that data is sent over in real time. So your recovery point objective is extremely low, usually in terms of a few minutes with recovery as a service. So once this is set up and running and it's protecting and keeping your data in sync, and notice these are not powered on because it's just storage right now, something happens to the production site. It could be a power outage, it could be a weather event, it could be storage corruption, a malicious user, maybe a former employee comes in through a back door and deletes the database. Really, whatever happens at the headquarters site, it goes away. The recovery site is powered up. Again, that takes a few minutes to a few hours depending on how many applications and how big they are. And then the user traffic is redirected over the network to the backup site. Once the production site comes back online, for example, if it was just a power outage, you might only be down for a day or two, or even just 12, 18 hours. That site eventually comes back online, but because the production environment's been running at Bluelock during that time, all the most recent changes have occurred out here. The cool thing is we can actually reestablish that continuous data protection back across the network, send all the changes that are happening in real time, but also all the changes that were missed over the last day or two or 12, 18 hours back to the production site, get it synced back up, power production back up and running, and then redirect the users over to the failback location. And as soon as that's done, the continuous data protection starts going the other way, back to the DR site to make sure that you're always protected all the time. So with that, let's dive a little bit deeper. And we're going to show a demo of installing the components that would be required in your Vsphere environment to start the replication process. And I'll talk about what those components are, and then I'll ask Craig to walk through the demo video that we have showing the installation itself. So the components that are involved in your data center, in your Vsphere environment, consist of a handful of things. So there is a virtual replication appliance called a VRA, and that's what actually moves the data back and forth between the Vsphere environment you're protecting and the Bluelock RaaS environment. There's a component called the ZVM. That's what creates the control panel that you can go in and set up your VPGs, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and your VPGs are what protect your applications. But this creates the control panel. The VPG is how you establish protection around a set of VMs. So let's say this was a group of VMs that ran a .NET application that you felt was worth protecting. You would create a VPG, which is basically a folder around those VMs, and then tell it to replicate out to Bluelock, and you would be protected. These VMs over here, because they're not in a VPG, they're not protected. And then the VRA itself, because it does the replication, it sits on every ESX or Vsphere host that you're protecting. What it does on that host is, because it is continuous data protection, it makes a copy of every write that goes from memory to disk and sends that write out to the Bluelock RaaS environment. As I mentioned before, the ZVM, once you install it, it creates a new tab in Virtual Center. We'll actually show you that here in a minute. That gives you the control panel and allows you to create as many VPGs and protect as many VMs as you want. So Craig, if you're there, if you wouldn't mind running through this, are you good?
Yeah, sure. So here we're going to go ahead and obviously in the spirit of demos, we did a little video here. So we're just going to kick off the installation. And here we're just giving it the basic information to install the software, and this will be provided by Bluelock at the time of installation. So here we're just putting in some basic, basic information to get the software going. Here we're connecting to the your vCenter server. We're just giving it some credentials information. And then here we're doing a quick little test. And then here finally we're going to install the software. So obviously that finishes pretty quick. And then here we'll go and open up the console just to make sure that we can see the Zerto tab and start connecting to Bluelock. As you can see, the installation is very easy and straightforward. There's not a whole lot to do here. Once we connect to Bluelock, this will actually leverage Bluelock's licensing information, so you don't need your own licensing. All of that's included in the solution. Here we're going to go ahead and deploy the VRAs, the agents on each of the hosts. Yes.
So just so we sort of describe everybody what happened there, that was installing the ZVM software appliance, which is what gave them access to the control panel. And now we're going to go set up the replication agents. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yep, here we're going to go ahead and install those agents. So for these, we'll just need to feed it some information where to place the agent. There's one per host. Give it the root password to the host itself. Find the data store in the network that this will communicate on. The amount of VRAM here, it just depends on how much data we're actually going to replicate. And then we'll just give, we're going to assign static IP to these VRA agents to communicate on our network. Once we install the manager actually takes care of installing the appliance virtual machine for us, so we don't have to worry about actually doing that. All we have to do is just feed it the pertinent information to get them deployed.
And I see you doing this twice, so you're installing this on 2 different ESX hosts?
That's correct. It's a one-to-one relationship. So there's one VRA per host. So if we had 5 hosts in our environment, we would actually have 5 VRAs.
Okay.
Yep. And there's only one manager, just to be clear. One manager and then one VRA per host. And we can see it installing here.
So it's almost like a backup agent, in that every server you want to protect, you have to have the agent on it.
That's correct. The VRAs actually handle grabbing the right information, grabbing the writes, the disk writes off of each host, and then sending that data across to Bluelock.
Okay.
So that's their purpose. The manager just simply manages the whole process. And we can see here that the VRAs show green lights, so that means that everything's communicating properly between the management server, the hosts, and also Bluelock.
Awesome. And in terms of the sizing that you showed there for some of the disks and the VRAM, is that something that we provide some guidance to the users on?
Definitely, definitely. And that'll depend upon, like I said, how much data that we intend to protect. So let's say, for example, if we're going to protect, you know, a total of a terabyte of information, we may use a slightly larger VRA. If we're protecting something very small, like maybe 200 gig, you know, we might choose a smaller VRA. Which actually that brings up another point about VRAs and the management. Really, the whole Zerto system. It doesn't. There's not a whole lot of load that it presents to the customer environment. So the impact of this system is really very, very minimal on the client side system. So there's not, you know, we'll never have to introduce another host or give it a huge amount more RAM in the environment to support this solution.
Yeah. Okay. So, perfect.
Yep.
All right. So the next part of the deep dive is we're actually going to show you how to, now that you've got the VRA and the ZVM up and running in your environment, show you how to actually use those through that new control panel that you have to protect an application. So just to refresh what we've shown you so far, so in your data center environment, and again, if your data center is actually Bluelock, we do all of this for you. So this assumes that your data center is a data center you're operating on your own. You saw Craig showed how he set up individual VRA agents on each of the ESX hosts that he wanted to protect. He installed the ZVM software appliance, which is just another VM in your environment. That's what created the little control panel tab in Virtual Center. And he connected it over a VPN tunnel that was already established through the internet to a Bluelock 4 series virtual data center, and it could be in Vegas or India. It really doesn't matter. It's just what IP addresses you use dictate which site you go to. We call them Zone East and Zone West. But anyway, pick whichever one you want that's appropriate for your app, and then the replication starts. So in terms of VPGs themselves, just as a virtualization refresh, we know that when virtualization first came on the scene, it introduced a hypervisor layer which abstracted the hardware from the operating system and allowed people to run multiple VMs on a single physical server. So VPG actually allows you to just group these individual VMs together, and you don't have to. You could pick one VM and put it in one VPG and replicate it over. VPG can hold up to 250 virtual machines if you just said, I want to replicate all of my data center in one shot, or you can break it down by business unit or application. But the key is virtual machines. So if we look at our example company, Grateco, again, and here's their data center here, we know they have a whole gob of virtual machines in their environment, different applications, operating systems, etc. And what we're going to show you how to do is basically pick a handful of those. In this case, we're picking a web application that's got an app server, database server, and a web server. We put that in one VPG, call that production, and then we replicate that over to a Bluelock 4 series virtual data center out in Vegas. The replication gets set up there, continuous data protection. Every time there's a change to production, it gets shot immediately out to the backup site through that encrypted tunnel, and off we go. As I mentioned before, you can create as many VPGs as you like, and they can all be redirected into one Bluelock virtual data center and protected with basically the exact same protection that each of them has. And again, in terms of why people would break these up, we see people that have just different ideas around containers. So some will put one application for a VPG, some will put all of marketing in a VPG, all of finance in another VPG. Tier 1 versus Tier 2 applications in different VPGs. There's a lot of different ways to do it.
Pat, we had a question there about that last slide. This is from Jamie. How is the initial seeding handled?
That's a good question. We're going to go through that right in the next section.
Great.
So we'll cover that in depth. Thank you, Jamie. And Jamie's setting us up for success. He's already seen the presentation. All right, so I'm going to go over into my RDP client and pull up the Vsphere client, and we're going to show you how to set up a VPG and protect an application. There we go. So hopefully you guys can see that. I'll try to make the screen a little bit bigger here. About as big as it's going to get. So you can see I'm in Vsphere client. This is what a VMware administrator uses to manage Vsphere today. And because Craig installed the ZVM, I now have the Zerto tab, and all of my hosts are running the VRA, which means I can protect any applications in my environment. And Craig, I'm actually going to hand it over to you. I personally like looking at the topology screen because it's really easy to show, you know, my boss that my site's protected by Zone 1 over at Bluelock. But then he starts asking questions about, you know, which VMs are protected and what the RTO and RPO stuff is, and I've got to click around a little bit. So what's the easiest way to sort of look at what's going on here?
The easiest way, we can actually look at the VPG itself. Simply by clicking on that tab. That's where we can actually see what VPGs we have set up. If we actually want to see the virtual machines that we are replicating even within the VPGs, we can click on either the name or the VMs tab, and that will show us some of those details. It tells us that this is a pretty busy screen. It gives us a lot of information. We can see kind of what's happening as far as the WAN traffic, you know, how much data we're actually transmitting. Obviously, to our boss, one of the main concerns is the RPO, so we can actually see that number right there and how, you know, sort of how much data needs to sort of get over to the other side.
So 9 seconds, is that good?
Yes, that is a very, very good number. Obviously, you know, being a demo environment, we don't have a whole lot going on in here, but in most environments, we'll typically see that under a minute, maybe a few minutes if they're pretty busy. But Zerto is very efficient. There's some compression stuff that it uses to transmit data to and from. I don't know, Pat, would you like to, there's actually a kind of a summary page, that first tab there, if you want to show them that as well. So this just shows us the overall status of the environment, how well it's doing, if all the lights are green, if things are working. So here it looks like everything's good. You know, with that little animation piece right in the middle there with the arrows, we can see that the connectivity is good between our site and Bluelock.
Okay. Looks like we're meeting our SLA over here. That sounds like a good thing.
Yep. We're meeting SLA. It shows us how many VPGs we're replicating there and whether those are good or not, and that light's green as well. We can see actually how much data we're protecting in the screen as well. We can also see some site performance, like in the detailed screen. We also see that here. So this is actually for the entire site, not just for particular virtual machines or VPGs. So that's one nice thing with Zerto, that actually gives us a very granular visibility, whether or not we want to see the entire site or whether we want to see specific aspects of the environment. So.
So my boss is here now. He's saying he's very happy that we actually performed a test about 2 weeks ago.
Yes. Yeah.
So
yeah.
That's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's with this solution, it's very easy to kick off tests. We can either do live tests or just simply do tests that aren't actually connected.
Okay. So how would so I'm thinking of two things. So in terms of the VPG, if let's say I wasn't protecting enough here, I thought this was great and I'm happy, but I realize I'm missing some things. How do I protect more?
Okay, well the first question is do we want to make a brand new VPG, or do we want to actually include those virtual machines in an existing VPG?
I think a new VPG.
Okay. So let's go ahead and you can kind of see the little rectangle over on the top right where it shows new VPG. Yep.
Okay.
And then we'll choose a recovery site. Here we just have the one recovery site, so we're just going to click continue. And then here we can name the VPG.
All right.
So you just go ahead and give it a, there you go. Boss's Minecraft. Nice. And then the target org VDC. And you
all right,
pick our
my 4 series there.
Keep
using
pick our
that.
4 series. And then here we've got 2 networks, and this is pretty cool. This actually allows us to do an actual move or a test. So this allows us to set up 2 different networks depending upon what the procedure we want to perform ultimately is, whether or not it's a full failover, whether or not it's a test failover. So oftentimes doing DR tests, we've got a lot of network challenges. So Zerpo's thought about that. So here we're going to go ahead and pick our move network, and then we can also, if you want, pick a test network.
Yeah, so maybe I'll test on the internal network, but my actual failover, I'll put it on the real network.
Yep. Okay, that's great. Now we click Add to add a virtual machine.
Okay.
That we want to protect.
And my boss is running his Minecraft server on our domain controller, but no one's supposed to know that, so we'll just do that.
Yeah, it's kind of like those multimedia servers. It's kind of like those multimedia servers running. Okay.
All right.
All right, so now that we have that, there's a few different options that we can choose in there. So if we go ahead and click back on that virtual machine, we just want to point out one thing here. So click on that, click configure.
Okay.
And then right here, this allows us to kind of fine tune some of the details in here as far as the source. We can configure the selected volume. So go ahead and click on that volume there with the 20 gig, and then click that. Yep. See here, we can actually either choose to copy or ignore the swap file. Obviously, swap it can be very, very busy, which would saturate or potentially saturate the link between the client site and Bluelock. So here we can ignore that particular swap file. So it's kind of a nice feature that's built in to the product. So by default,
so you don't have to figure that out, on your own, or
exactly.
click that every time, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And then we can also, here we can also choose to thin provision the VDC data store on the remote side as well, which kind of helps us save a little bit of money.
And what does that do? That makes sure that I don't replicate space that's empty, right?
Exactly, white space.
Yeah.
Space.
Yeah. So if I had like a 200 gig VM, but I'm only using 30 gigs, it'll only protect 30, and then I only have to pay for 30, right? Not 200 on the DR side. That's pretty
precisely.
Cool.
Yep.
All right.
And then we can also do some pre-seeding as well. If we have a very, very large VM and we don't have a lot of bandwidth, we can actually use basically some way to transport the VMDK file to the remote site, whether it's a USB drive or something like that, to kind of provide a pre-seed.
Yeah, and that was, I think, Jamie's question earlier. And Jamie, we've done a lot of different ways depending on the amount of data. We've had some environments as big as, I think, 200 terabytes where we had to actually send an array out to the customer site, and they put the data on the array, send it out, and then we synced up all the changes that had happened between then and production. We haven't done that a lot recently because the replication with this solution is so efficient, and because the applications can run during the replication, you never have to power them off until you've got them completely seeded. Most people don't have to ship us media anymore. So good news is that the technology has gotten very much modernized and improved and made some of those seeding issues that we ran into in the past go away. But obviously, if for some reason we need to do it, there are lots of ways to get that done. Okay?
All right. very good.
All right. So the other thing, Craig, I wanted to know was, so let's say I wanted to actually fail an application over. What do I do?
Sure. Okay. Let's go ahead and cancel out of that. Basically, at that point, once we click save, it would start the replication and start the initial copy. So if we want to actually fail over, in this case here, we can either do per virtual machine or VPG itself. So all we have to do is select it there. And then down on the bottom of the screen, there's the big red button. So we can either do a test or a live. Live obviously is a real failover, and that actually puts it in the appropriate network. Test does the same thing, thereby only providing a test. There's a little move button there. In certain cases, we've actually used that to help migrate virtual machines from a customer site to a cloud, or in cloud from our Indianapolis to Las Vegas data center. So it's a nice little feature.
Yeah, it works a lot better than uploading them through the browser if you have to move a VM, because it allows the source VM to basically stay on as long as possible until it's completely replicated over, just like a disaster recovery situation, but it's more of a migration to or from the cloud.
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and hit this button if that's okay.
Yeah. Yep. Go ahead.
All right.
Yep. So here we select the VPG. Here we just have the one, so we're going to go with that one. So go ahead and click next.
Okay. And if I had 5 of these, they would all be here, and I could click them all, right?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So here we configure. Here we can do a commit policy, whether it's a commit after a certain time or whether we want to fail back after a certain time. So this kind of allows us a little bit of flexibility in how we fail over. Obviously, part of the failover is there's a small testing period that we typically want to perform just to make sure that when we bring up that virtual machine that it's actually functional. If it's not functional, or if we notice something really bad, with it that's going on, we may actually want to intentionally have it automatically fail back. It really just depends on the type of failure and the type of situation that we're going through.
Yeah, so if I said it to automatically roll back after 20 minutes, I'd have 20 minutes to go in, make sure everything worked, and if things weren't working, then it would automatically roll back, and I could go troubleshoot. But if everything was working great, I could just hit the commit button, and it would fail me over to that copy right away, right?
Yep, that's okay. Exactly right. And then here we can choose, as far as a shutdown, we can have it actually forcibly shut down our source machine. Checkpoint, that's a nice feature. Yeah, the checkpoint is a nice feature as well, where it allows us to, let's say we were infected with a virus at a certain time, it allows us to go back to a previous point in time to be able to recover from an earlier point. So you can see there we've got a lot of different times, and it may even go back. Sometimes we can actually get them going back a few days.
Yeah, it just depends on how much disk space you allocate, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I've got I've got another question here. I just wanted to interject real quick. One of the attendees had asked whether what we're seeing here is something that the clients are actually going to be setting up themselves, or if this is something that they need the Bluelock team to help them set up.
Yeah, so good question. There are 2 scenarios, maybe 3 scenarios now that I think about it a little bit. So if you are hosting your production environment in Bluelock, that means your backup environment is also in Bluelock. We will configure and set this all up for you based on the policies that you tell us. So if your recovery time objective is 2 hours, your recovery point objective is 30 minutes, etc., we'll do the heavy lifting and click all these buttons and just make the service work for you. We have a portal where you can see that the service is working. but it basically just says whether or not the environment's protected and whether or not you're achieving your RTO and your RPO. So it's very simple for a non-technical user to look at and realize whether or not they're being effectively protected. And there are alerts and whatnot if you're suddenly out of protection for some reason. The other two scenarios are, as you can see, this is a self-service interface. So if you are a VMware administrator or a VMware engineer and you have access to your vSphere client, this is the tool that you would use to add and remove VPGs and set all the protection up yourself. If this is something that's new to you or it's not as intuitive as maybe it was, we hope, we will spend time with you and make sure that we help you set up your initial replication seeds, your initial VPGs, et cetera, basically training the trainer so that you can take over and set up additional things on your own. But we have a professional services team and a support team that's there to help you be successful when you're first getting started. And that's the pattern we typically observe is most people need that first VPG or two built with us, and then they build all the rest on their own.
Thanks, Pat.
All right. So I'm going to go and cancel out of that instead of hitting the failover button. I know it takes about 10 minutes, and in our demo webinar, we actually show the whole process of work from soup to nuts and show the routing changes and DNS changes, but that's not in this session today. So I'm going to go back over, and we're going to talk about back to Jamie's question, the impact on seeding and the network.
And again, while Pat's loading that up, and just a reminder, if you guys had any other questions or comments, feel free to submit those via the Q&A or chat panels. As much as we do love Pat's presentations, we would love for these to be more of a conversation than a monologue. So we are here to help. We'd like to answer or address any specific concerns or needs you have. So again, if you have anything else you'd like us to touch on or add clarification to, feel free to submit those comments.
Yep. Speaking of that, John, we did have a couple other questions come up. Are there VM size limits? This is driven by Vsphere, so it basically just takes on whatever the size limitations are of the version of Vsphere that you're running. So beyond the limits of Vsphere itself, there are no size limits in terms of the size of the VMs you can protect. And someone asked, what's the average link speed for current users? As you can probably imagine, that varies quite a bit. We do a network sizing exercise with you, and we have some best practices to help you understand what the impact of replicating across your current network connection would be to the cloud. Again, most people aren't doing that today, so this is additional traffic that your internet connection or your wide area connection, if you're coming to us over an MPLS network, might not have transmitted before. The rule of thumb that we use if you're just looking for a ballpark is take the total amount of data that you're protecting, and again, from a thin provisioning standpoint, not how much has been allocated, and then average around 4 to 7% of that will change on a daily basis. And that's the amount of data that, in a highly changing environment, you'll probably have to transmit over the network to the backup site. We have a number of ways we're going to show you now to cut down on that amount of traffic, and also we can talk to you if you are interested in some different network technologies that are available that might even reduce the impact of that on your network more, and that helps lower cost and take that cost you would have been spending on network traffic and drive it into protecting more data.
I've actually got another testing specific question here. Sony was interested in whether they could run their own DR testing or DR exercise without having to pull in Bluelock to assist.
Oh, that's an excellent question. Absolutely. So just like we talked about having both a fully managed option available for you, if you don't have your own team or you'd rather have your team focus on different activities than disaster recovery, Bluelock can fulfill that for you, but at the same time, you don't have to have us involved. So we have people that literally on a Friday night will look at the weekend weather report and get a little nervous about, you know, a storm that's coming in, and we'll log into the self-service portal that we just showed you. They'll power up a couple VMs or a whole application in the DR environment, kick the tires, make sure it works, and go home more comfortable and confident that the solution works. And the only thing Bluelock will notice is that your utilization ticked up a little bit in your 4 series virtual data center for a few hours, but you don't have to let us know. We do actually something kind of innovative around testing too. If you call us and let us know that you're going to do the test, we'll actually credit you the resources back that you used during the testing. So let's say you would have used 50 gigs of RAM during the test. If you coordinate that with us ahead of time, we'll actually waive the fees for that test. But you don't have to do that. You can log in on Friday night, do it, and not tell us.
Awesome. Thanks, Pat.
So impact of all this on the network. So great question. So as you can see, every time you create a new VPG, it's going to impact your network because there's that initial sync that has to be done. And after that's done, you have all these little tiny syncs that go on. The thing that we worry about, and this is why we work with you to size these environments, is if your network has a cap on it, that if this initial sync hits that cap, it'll take a lot longer because it'll stretch out and try and, you know, look about 10 times that wide instead of tall. The other thing is there was probably activity on your network prior to when you started the sync, and the last thing we want to do is have the your DR replication traffic squash something important like YouTube or maybe even more important, some access of your Salesforce to salesforce.com. So we work with you to help figure all of that out. The other thing that we have access to is a new network product from TW Telecom that essentially gives you cloud-style network bandwidth where you have an almost unlimited cap and you only pay for what you use. So in that model, that limitation for the most part goes away, but it doesn't, you know, you can get a gigabit connection, but you're not paying for one whole gigabit of traffic all the time. So it's kind of cool. And again, if anybody has any questions about that, please ask. So in terms of optimizing the replication, the software itself comes with data compression built in. It's turned on by default, so you don't have to do that, and we found that to be really pretty effective in terms of the total amount of compression that it does. It takes that raw network feed and basically just cuts it down. The other thing, other than the initial sync that can get affected by congested network or too many changes in your environment based on what the network can handle, is your RPO. So you saw that the recovery point objective, which measures the amount of data that would be lost if you'd have a failover during replication, is usually in a handful of minutes if everything's working great, which is a super aggressive RPO. If you started an initial seed and while that, say VPG3 is doing its initial sync out to the environment and it takes up all the bandwidth that VPG1 and 2 were using to replicate, that data is going to queue and wait in line, and that'll cause your RPO to fluctuate up. So some other options, basically that just shows that here. So you're sending all these seeds out, and now your RPO has gone up. If you turn compression on, it goes back down. Ephemeral data is another really bad thing because it's basically data that the replication agent thinks is important to send out to the recovery site. It's typically changing all the time because it's log data or swap file data, so it's constantly replicating, creating chatter on your network, but it's really not giving you any value because there's no actual data being sent out there. And we put the cart before the horse a little bit, but as Craig showed you, that swap file and some of that ephemeral data is already marked out by the replication software so it doesn't get replicated and cause that problem. And then the final thing, actually, let's see. Yeah, I think we pretty much already covered everything here. Yeah, and then here's the screenshot. Craig, we did such a good job that we killed the last 4 slides because we covered it already. So it's so nice we said it twice. But as you can see here, again, the swap file's not included. That saves efficiency. Compression's turned on. Then provisioning is already turned on, so you're only sending actual data, not empty disk space out there, et cetera, and so on. So how do you make your next move? So what we've learned is that people are at all different stages of their journey in trying to figure this out. Some of you are trying to move from an existing DR solution to a more modern one like RaaS. Others may have only protected 1 or 2 applications today and see this as an opportunity because of how simple and affordable it is to protect a lot of other applications that are in their environment. Some of you have found yourselves going from supporting back office applications like email and file servers and print servers to supporting mission critical revenue generating applications for your business, and you really don't have good ways to do that because you're still using tape backup or maybe disk to disk backup, and you have no second location. Anyway, so what we try to do is basically offer the next step that we see people take. If you're in your organization and you're nervous about the vulnerability of the applications that you have, but from a company standpoint, DR, it doesn't seem to be a priority or it's getting underfunded, what we see people do is start the conversation. And you probably heard the phrase is, how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. The way to do that with making DR a priority is to focus on one application at a time. It's very easy. I'm an IT person. Almost everyone at Bluelock came from IT, and we all like to think big. We all like to think comprehensive and holistically, and protect all the applications all the time, back everything up, put everything on high availability storage. The reality is that the business sees different applications at different levels of priority and importance. So if you can find one application that the majority of people in the business would agree is really critical to the operations, start the conversation around protecting that. Once you figure out how to do that, you'll find that it's very easy to then add additional applications as you understand the risk. DR is too expensive, so that's been a challenge for a lot of people in the past. Others would say that I'm not sure my DR solution is going to work. When we tested it, it didn't work, or it took 2 days to get back online, and I need it back on in 2 hours. We say, go get a quote or a demo, and again, focus on one application. All you need to do is share the amount of data that needs to be protected, how many CPUs, how much RAM, disk I/O, and VMs. So just a handful of things that you can get right out of your Vsphere client, and we can produce some numbers for you, and I think you'll be really surprised with how little it would take to protect an environment. Connecting to the cloud is too complex. Again, whether it's a demo environment or protecting a single application, this is a great way to get started and understand how to set that VPN tunnel up, how to map Active Directory out to a cloud environment. I think you'll find it's just like running a remote office or a back office environment that you're probably already familiar with. Cloud is too risky. We hear that with production applications, but it seems like if you don't have a second location, that cloud is perfect because it takes risk away instead of adding risk to your environment. And if it's not your skill set, as we talked about with you before, we can either help train you up where it becomes a skill that you have or a skill that's in your team, or we can take it on as a managed service if you'd rather prioritize somewhere else.